Sister Ngozi, or should we skip you today? We don't want your empty basket to shame the Lord's work.
5 years the same rapper. 5 years.
I gave what I have. God does not measure the cloth on a person's back. Maybe God is still waiting for you to have something to give.
Let us continue with the service. I apologize for interrupting. I am looking for the owner of this building. My documents say her name is Ngozi Adeyemi.
What did he just...
Her name was Ngozi, and for 11 years, that church knew her as the woman in the back pew, the one with the faded wrapper, the one whose basket always came back light. They called her poor, they called her forgotten, they called her behind cupped hands but loud enough for her to hear, a burden on the ministry. They did not know what she carried on her head every morning before dawn. They did not know what she buried in the ground behind her small rented room. They did not know that the woman they mocked every Sunday owned the very floor they stood on to laugh at her. This is her story. 6 years earlier, Ngozi Adeyemi buried her husband, Chief Adeyemi Okonkwo, a quiet businessman who kept his affairs to himself and his wife close to his heart. He left her 2 things: a small, run-down rental room in a forgotten part of Lagos and a locked metal box she was told never to open until the time was right. She did not know what the right time meant. She only knew grief and hunger and a church that welcomed her with open arms until they realized she had nothing left to give. At first, the sympathy came easily. Sister Ngozi, so sorry for your loss. Sister Ngozi, the Lord will provide. But sympathy in that congregation had a shelf life and has expired the moment her tailored dresses turned to second-hand wrappers and her seat moved quietly without anyone saying a word from the third pew to the very back. Deaconess Fumilayo noticed everything. She was the wife of the church's biggest financial backer, Elder Bassi, a man who had personally funded the new roof, the new sound system, the marble flooring at the altar. Fumilayo wore her husband's money like a crown, and she made sure everyone knew exactly where they stood beneath her. Sister Ngozi, she said one Sunday, holding the offering basket just out of reach, we don't want your empty basket to shame the Lord's work. Maybe just watch today. Laughter rippled through the hall. Not everyone laughed. Some looked away, ashamed of their own silence, but enough laughed that Ngozi felt it in her chest like a slap. She did not cry, not there. She smiled, the smile of a woman who had buried a husband and swallowed worse. I gave what I have, she said quietly. God does not measure the cloth on a person's back. Maybe God is still waiting for you to have something to give, Fumilayo shot back, and the congregation laughed again, and the pastor, a soft man named Reverend Uzo, who owed his position to Elder Bassi's tithes, cleared his throat and said nothing at all. That was the pattern. Every Sunday, a new insult dressed as a joke, a new reminder that she did not belong among people with real houses and real husbands and real futures. There was the Sunday the Women's Fellowship organized a sisters' luncheon and quietly forgot to send Ngozi an invitation card, though every other widow in the congregation received one hand-delivered to her door. When Ngozi asked gently why hers never came, Fumilayo smiled and said, "Oh, we assumed you would be busy with, your trading." There was the Sunday the youth choir needed uniforms, and the announcement was made that those who can contribute should contribute generously, unlike some who only come to receive. Ngozi sat through it with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the cracked tiles of the church floor, saying nothing. There was the Hamatan morning. Her wrapper, the only good one she owned, got caught in the church gate and tore slightly at the hem, and she heard quite clearly a group of younger women whispering and giggling 2 pews ahead. She mended it herself that night with a needle and thread by candlelight, because paying for a tailor was not something her groundnut earnings allowed. Ngozi never complained to the pastor. She never wrote a letter to the board. She endured, the way she had endured her husband's long business trips in their marriage, the way she had endured watching neighbors build houses, while she and her husband lived humbly and quietly, saving instead of spending, planning instead of showing off. Her husband, Chief Adeyemi Okonkwo, had always told her in the last years of his life, "Ngozi, the people who need to see what we have will see it when the time is right. Until then, let them underestimate us. It is safer that way." She had not fully understood what he meant until the metal box came into her hands. Now, she understood completely. She thought of him often in those quiet nights. How he would rise before dawn to travel to Ibadan, to Abuja, to towns she never asked questions about, always returning with the same gentle, tired smile and the same instruction. Save what I bring you. Do not spend it on appearances. She had obeyed him faithfully, even after his death, even when appearances were the only currency that seemed to matter at Living Faith. What they did not know was this. Every night, after the market closed and her feet ached from selling groundnuts by the roadside, Ngozi went home to that small rented room and sat with the metal box her husband left behind. She had opened it 3 years ago, on the day the lawyer finally released the will's second condition, a condition sealed with instructions not to be touched until a specific date. Inside that box were deeds, property deeds, land her husband had quietly acquired over 20 years under a private company name that meant nothing to anyone who did not know to look for it. And one deed, dated 18 years earlier, stood out from all the rest. The land beneath Living Faith Chapel, the very church that now mocked her, had been purchased by her husband, Chief Adeyemi Okonkwo, under Okonkwo Heritage Holdings, long before the church board ever built on it. He had leased it to the congregation for a symbolic 1 naira a year, quietly, generously, asking nothing in return but that the arrangement remained private until his estate settled. Ngozi had known for 3 years. She said nothing. Not out of fear, out of grief, out of exhaustion, out of a stubborn refusal to use her husband's memory as a weapon against people who were, in her mind, still supposed to be her spiritual family. But grief has a limit, and humiliation, repeated enough times, becomes a debt that must be paid. The final straw came on a Sunday like any other, 3 weeks before Harvest Thanksgiving. The church board, led by Elder Bassi and Deaconess Fumilayo, announced a new redevelopment plan. They would demolish the old chapel and build a 500-seat auditorium with a rooftop fellowship hall funded by a foreign investor Bassi had been courting for 2 years. And as for the back pew, Fumilayo added, scanning the room with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "We will be restructuring seating entirely. Some people," she said, letting her gaze rest deliberately on Ngozi, "may find they are no longer needed in this building at all." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Even those who laughed at Ngozi before felt something cold pass through the room. But no one spoke. Ngozi stood. Slowly, every eye turned to her. "Before you demolish anything," she said, her voice steady for the first time in 6 years, "you should know whose name is on the land." Fumilayo laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Sister Ngozi, please sit down. This is a board matter." "The land," Ngozi repeated, "was purchased 18 years ago by Okonkwo Heritage Holdings, my husband's company. I have held the original deed since his passing." The hall went silent. Reverend Uzo's face drained of color. Elder Bassi's jaw tightened. "That is not possible," Fumilayo said, but her voice cracked on the last word. Ngozi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You may ask your lawyers to verify the land registry at the Lagos State Ministry of Lands. File number Block 14, Plot 9. It has been in my late husband's company name since before this church poured its first foundation. She turned and walked out of the church that Sunday. Back straight, wrapper faded, and for the first time in 6 years, no one laughed. The following 2 weeks unraveled everything the congregation thought it knew. Elder Bassey's lawyers confirmed what Nkosi already knew. The land was legally, indisputably owned by Okonkwo Heritage Holdings, now solely controlled by Nkosi as sole surviving beneficiary and majority shareholder following the release of her husband's estate. The lease agreement, drafted personally by her late husband, contained a clause neither Bassey nor the board had ever bothered to read closely. It could be terminated by the landholder with 90 days' notice at the landholder's sole discretion for any reason. Nkosi issued the notice herself, in writing, delivered by courier to the church office on a quiet Tuesday morning. 90 days. No explanation required. Elder Bassey called an emergency board meeting the very next morning. Voices could be heard from outside the church office, raised, panicked, accusatory. Someone should have checked the land registry before construction began. Someone should have verified ownership before any foreign investor was approached. Fingers pointed in every direction, but never toward the woman they had spent 6 years dismissing as irrelevant. The panic that followed exposed things the congregation never expected. Elder Bassey, desperate to save face and his investment with the foreign backer, tried to negotiate privately, offering Nkosi a settlement, a bribe dressed as a gift if she would simply extend the lease and stay silent about the ownership. She refused every offer. Not out of spite, she told him calmly, but because money had never been the thing she was owed. Respect was. Word spread through the congregation and then through the wider community faster than any sermon ever had. The woman in the faded wrapper, the one they laughed at, the one they moved to the back pew, the one they joked did not belong, owned the ground beneath their feet. And she had known it and said nothing for 3 years while they humiliated her every single Sunday. Deaconess Fumilayo's fall was the hardest of all. Her husband's business partnerships began to unravel once whispers of the scandal reached his investors. Men who did not appreciate discovering that Elder Bassey had built his church empire on land he never actually controlled, and that his wife had spent years publicly humiliating the true owner. Contracts fell through. Long-standing business relationships quietly dissolved. Within 4 months, Elder Bassey's construction company, the same one meant to fund the grand new auditorium, filed for restructuring under crushing debt the collapsed redevelopment deal left behind. Fumilayo, who once wore her husband's wealth like armor, found herself selling her own jewelry to cover household expenses. Her children, once the pride of the congregation's youth choir, withdrew from the private school they'd bragged about for years. The same women who once flocked around her at fellowship hour now crossed the room to avoid an awkward conversation. She came to Nkosi's rented room herself, 6 months after that fateful Sunday, unannounced, without her usual entourage. She stood at the door in a plain dress, nothing like the tailored suit she once wore to humiliate a widow with an offering basket. "I came to apologize," Fumilayo said, her voice small in a way Nkosi had never heard before. "I was cruel to you. I don't know why I thought I had the right." Nkosi studied her for a long moment. She thought about the back pew, the empty basket held out like a joke, the laughter that followed her home every Sunday for 6 years. "I forgive you," Nkosi said finally, and she meant it. "But I will not forget what it taught me. that kindness should never depend on what a person appears to have. She did not invite Funmilayo back into her life. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no rebuilding of friendship. Forgiveness, Ngozi had learned, did not require reopening a wound simply to prove it had healed. She offered Funmilayo something else instead. A small trading stall in the new community market Ngozi's foundation had helped fund, an honest way to rebuild a life stripped of its former excess. Funmilayo accepted, quietly, without pride, and the two women never became friends, but they nodded to each other now with something that resembled peace whenever their paths crossed at the market gate. With the land now fully hers to develop, Ngozi did something no one in the congregation expected. She did not sell it. She did not evict the church entirely. Instead, she used a portion of her husband's estate to build a new, smaller worship hall on an adjoining plot, one specifically designed with a scholarship fund for widows and struggling families in the community, women who might otherwise sit quietly in a back pew, invisible until someone decided they no longer belonged. She named the fund after her husband. She stood at its dedication in a tailored deep blue dress this time, not out of vanity, but because she had earned the right to stop apologizing for surviving. The scholarship fund's first beneficiaries included two widows from her own street, women who sold pepper and dried fish beside her in the same market stall, women who understood exactly what it meant to be quietly erased by people who once called themselves family in Christ. Ngozi personally interviewed each applicant herself, sitting with them over tea, asking not for proof of hardship, but simply for their stories, because she remembered what it felt like when no one wanted to hear hers. Local newspapers picked up the story eventually, a small feature at first, then a longer profile after a Lagos business journal traced the full history of Okonkwo Heritage Holdings and its quiet, decades-long portfolio of community-benefiting land deals her husband had built without ever seeking credit. Reporters asked Ngozi why her husband kept everything so private. She told him what he once told her: build in silence. Let the noise come from other people's mouths, not your own. Elder Bassi eventually stepped down from church leadership altogether, unable to recover the trust of a congregation that had watched him nearly cost them their place of worship over pride and carelessness. He and Funmilayo downsized to a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city, far from the social circles that once revolved around them. Ngozi heard through the market grapevine that Funmilayo now attended a small chapel 2 neighborhoods away where no one knew her name or her history. Reverend Uzo, humbled by everything that had unfolded, personally invited her to sit at the front of the new hall on opening day. She smiled, thanked him kindly, and chose to sit exactly where she always had, in the back. Not because she was told to, because from there, she said, you can see everyone, and she never wanted to forget what it felt like to be unseen. The congregation that once mocked her now greets her with respect that feels some days uncomfortably late. But Ngozi carries no bitterness. She carries only the quiet knowledge that the ground beneath every proud, judgmental foot in that building was hers all along. If this story moved you, you already know what to do. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the people who overlook you today may be standing on ground you already own tomorrow. Because in the end, the wrapper does not determine the woman, and the back pew is sometimes exactly where the landlord chooses to sit.